What is the historical order of the New Testament? Now, before we get into that, we want to first clarify some important terms. History, for those of you who don't know, is translated from the word histor, which is literally synonymous with eyewitness. It's what people have seen happen in the past. That's the most plain definition of history we can make. Now, also noting that we are more certain about history based off of whether or not there were more people at the same time who said essentially the same thing. And these include, of course, major details, since no two people are going to report all of the minor events. Now, noting this then, let's recognize and review those major events. But before we get into that, we also need to clarify, as we did with the Old Testament, what kind of history is the New Testament? And the answer is Jewish and Roman history. Not 21st century American history, but first century Jewish and Roman history. The focus, of course, is on the actions of the Jewish people, one in particular, most of all, that being Jesus of Nazareth. But this is during the Roman era of European and Middle Eastern history. And the entire New Testament as a whole would take place, at least date-wise by our standards, around 4 BC to almost certainly 90 AD. We aren't exactly sure about when Jesus was born, not because the event itself is in question. We have his death publicly documented, and it's hard to die if you were never born. But it's also worth noting that the reason why we would put it around 4 BC is because we have other verifiable figures in history, like Herod the Great, whose death was around 4 BC. And if he was involved shortly before his death in the birth of Jesus, it would be very hard for him to have died before Jesus was born if he was there. So we take those key details and conclude that perhaps our data isn't wrong, our dates are. The calendar itself wasn't divinely inspired, which is why it's in our Bibles. But if on the other hand you're going to say, how certain can we be that Jesus was born? Note that point. We have absolute certainty that individuals like Herod the Great, Caesar Augustus, Quirinius, and all the other individuals that Matthew and Luke give so that we can be certain to cross-examine and check that Jesus was in fact an individual in a moment of history. We can also check other individuals, Roman historians like Tacitus, Greek historians like Pliny, and of course Jewish historians like Josephus. These are names that you're going to want to be familiar with when engaging with atheists and Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslims that will question the corruption or lack thereof in the Bible. So, noting that point, then, what do we know about the Gospels? Well, the Gospel of Luke in particular, but every single one of them emphasizing the same major events are all eyewitness documentaries of the life of Jesus. They're obviously going to recap something fairly straightforward. It starts with the birth, if they were witnesses to it. Matthew and Luke were able to interview eyewitnesses like, say, for example, Mom, who was still alive during his time, or Matthew, who could just access the Roman records, which is why he makes more references to the Roman government, whereas Luke goes into more details about Mary's own experiences. It was based on their source. Peter, his gospel, the gospel according to Mark, who was his disciple and scribe, only begins with the baptism of John the Baptist because that's when he first met Jesus. And he's only going to report what he saw because it's his story. Also note that John begins not at his birth, but at the beginning of creation, since Jesus in his divine nature, as God the Son, always existed. So, clarifying that, then it goes from his birth to his baptism, where his earthly ministry began. It goes from his baptism and earthly ministry all the way to his crucifixion, and then crucifixion to resurrection. Then, following the four gospel accounts, the four eyewitness documentaries of the life of Jesus with different emphases based on their backgrounds, Matthew being a tax collector and a Roman occupation, as well as a Jew by birth, he focuses on the biblical prophecies and the Roman background of Jesus' life, or his involvement rather. Mark, obviously, speaking to Peter, it was his eyewitness testimony firsthand. Luke wanted to clarify and set in proper order Matthew's account, not because it was necessarily out of order, but he wanted to clarify those details as a doctor by getting more than one eyewitness to corroborate it. And so we have extra details, but all the major events remain the same, and none of the minor events conflict. Also note that John and his experiences with Jesus wanted to emphasize a very important and foundational detail about the life of Jesus that the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, hadn't gone into, not as much. They certainly did, but not as much detail as John, where he focuses on, I believe, 8 or 9 major miracles in statements that Jesus made throughout his ministry that he bore personal eyewitness to that emphasized his divine nature. So, all that said, note you can prove the deity of Christ from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but the objective of John was to focus on that. If you want to find out that Jesus is the promised Messiah, you're familiar with the Old Testament, you'd go to Matthew. If you want to know what it was like living with Jesus, you'd read Mark. And of course, if you want a historian's eye view, in particular a Roman standard of history, you'd read Luke. So, I believe I said that twice. Nonetheless, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Noting that point. Acts would then follow as a historical record that covers about 30 years of history. The date of Jesus' death, again, we don't have it exactly solid. It was either 30 or 33 AD, but noting that point as well, even atheist scholars would acknowledge it's one of the most certain facts of ancient history, so we put it in that timeline, but we will be honest where we're uncertain, and covers about 30 years of history going all the way to Paul's first trial before Emperor Nero. Now, since we know when Nero died, we're definitely going to put a capstone there and say, just like with Herod and Jesus' birth, if we know when Nero died, it would be hard for Paul to stand before him in trial if he wasn't there anymore. So that would be that timeline is set. But then continuing on from that point, the apostles, of course, wrote the letters, the followers of Jesus that were sent out by him. Follower, disciple, sent out one, apostle. Note the definitions. But John, of course, was the only one of them that wasn't ultimately martyred, and he wrote his letters for 2nd and 3rd John, as well as the Gospel according to John and the book of Revelation around 90 AD, and we can corroborate that not only from his disciple Polycarp and other sources that weren't even Christian, but also noting as well he was imprisoned by the Roman emperor at the time, I believe either Domitian or Diocletian. I'm leaning towards Domitian. But either of these Roman emperors, its name starts with a D, they imprisoned John after they failed to kill him by poisoning him, and he survived. He rotted in the prison island known as Patmos until his death, and then the succeeding Roman emperor released him and allowed him to fill out the end of his life in the Greek city port of Ephesus. And that's where he wrote those 4 letters. So I'm sure he wrote others, but the ones that are in our Bibles. So with all that said, that is the writing structure and order of these events, of these books in our New Testament. So then asking the third and most relevant question to this topic, how is this history written? Well, the New Testament is organized the same way that the Old Testament was organized. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as the book of Acts, would all fall into the category of history. So when you're reading Matthew, you're getting the historical record of Jesus' life. When you're reading Mark, well, you haven't gone beyond Jesus' life yet, but you're getting another perspective. These, of course, are focusing on their various backgrounds, as what was stated before. And then noting Acts, which was also written by the physician Luke, by the way, interviewed the events surrounding Pentecost, the early church, the first persecution that broke out in Jerusalem, Saul's conversion into the Apostle Paul, and then from his missionary onward, he records everything from interviewing the eyewitnesses until he joined them. And then you would note, and can read about this in Norman Geisler's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, the amount of excruciatingly finite, or I guess the word would be almost unnecessarily specific details of an eyewitness are going to escalate. He was able to ask the events that only a doctor would care about, but it's also worth noting and important to mention that when you start to get into details as far as we approached this particular island on this particular trade route using this particular kind of ship under these particular kind of conditions, he gets the slang terms right. He uses cultural and distinctive city terms for elected officials that were only utilized within that time period with a margin of error of about 4 years. Acts is about as historical as it gets, with Luke being the only one to top it. Now, this is why individuals like Sir William Ramsay reported that Luke was a historian of the first rank. So this is the quality of information we're given in the New Testament. 4 different biographies, which are obviously historical records, eyewitness records of the life of Jesus, and then Acts follows up 30 years after. Then we get to Romans through Philemon, which would begin the poetry section, the writings section of the New Testament. These, of course, are personal letters written to groups or individuals. Philemon, for example, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, these are written to their specific students. Or if you're looking, say, for the book of Romans, it wasn't written to a guy named Roman, it was to the church in Rome. And on it goes. And so Roman through Philemon are organized first, and they were the ones that were written by Paul. Hebrews, we don't know the author, but many have theorized it is in fact the Apostle Paul, but it was transcribed by Luke. So we see a mixture of writings. Others say it was Apollos, others say that it was Peter, others say it was someone else. But since we can't test the author, we don't know for certain, we have to judge it based on its substance. And since about a quarter to a third of the entire book is just spent quoting the Old Testament, we just look to the Old Testament and see, okay, since that's what this book is based on, we can test and verify that. But James then goes on as the leader of the early church and Jesus' half-brother when Mary and Joseph got married after Jesus was born. Notes that Joseph did not know his wife, according to the account of Matthew, until she brought forth her firstborn son. After that, they had a normal Jewish family. We are aware of at least 6 of Jesus' siblings, and noting that James was the firstborn son of Jesus, or Joseph and Mary, but noting as well Jesus was the firstborn son of Mary, but not Joseph. We also know Judas, John, and others. We are told that he has sisters, so that would note at least 2, and so the family of Jesus would have been around 6 kids at minimum, assuming sisters means there were only 2 of them. So Mary had a normal family, normal Jewish woman after Jesus' birth. But noting this, he was the leader in the early church, and he doesn't really claim that as a call to title. He was just regarded as such because he was called by God once he found out that it was in fact his brother. But that point aside, James, of course, wrote the epistle according to James, and as the leader in the early church, he did have the sort of clout and weight behind his words that people would want to regard, and he was also tested in the same way that all the Old Testament prophets, and Paul the Apostle included as well, were tested. 1st and 2nd Peter were obviously written by Peter. 1st through 3rd John were written by the Apostle John. This was towards the end of his life, by the way. Jude was written by Judas, who was another one of Jesus' biological half-brothers. Remember, when you're a part of a Jewish culture, the name Judah, from the term Jew, you catch the drift there, is, of course, going to be a popular name. So if you see Judas, don't automatically think Iscariot. There were 2 Judases, in fact, that were among Jesus' disciples. One of them speaks in the Gospel according to John, where he says, Judas, not Iscariot, asked him. And on it goes. And then finally, Revelation is the prophecy section of the New Testament. Just like the prophets are after history and poetry in the Old Testament, Revelation concludes, written by the Apostle John, and it was during his imprisonment, yes, Emperor Domitian, during his time and imprisonment on Patmos. So that is the historical background, order, and structure of the New Testament. If you have any other questions or would like to know more details about how we test this information, feel free to ask in the comments. I look forward to talking to you all more about this, and when we get another chance to discuss these very important questions and the answers therein, we're going to be talking about the Old and New Testaments as far as what that word means, testament or covenant. I look forward to seeing you all next time. God bless you.